Coming up, we're talking fashion and asking what secrets are sewn into the clothes we wear. Catch it next on this episode of Black History Year.
It's the Monday you've been waiting for. DSW's Cyber Monday sale is happening now at DSW.com. Today only, save 35% on almost everything online. Score the best deals of the year on must-have shoes, giftable bags, and cozy extras for everyone on your list, including you. Don't miss out. Save 35% online only at DSW.com today. Exclusions apply. Details at DSW.com.
Fashion statements. What does your fashion say about you? Think about it. Would Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches have landed the same way if he was wearing a pinky ring and a Coca-Cola mink fur? Does rocking a dashiki make you down for the cause? When Prince put on those assless chaps at the VMAs, what was he really saying? And why were folks so pissed when Obama wore a tan Easter suit? I guess what I'm really asking is, what fashion got to do with politics? Because fashion is never just fabric. It's a statement, a code, a story. And every story has a history. I'm Darren, and you're listening to Black History Year. Joining us today is Kimberly Jenkins, an award-winning scholar, researcher, and fashion expert. She's here to help us hem up exactly why we wear what we wear and what it means when fashion becomes a social movement. But first, some history.
Black bodies were not their own during enslavement. Racists enacted all types of ridiculous things to keep us in bondage and under their control. Here's how we outsmarted one of their most out-of-pocket rules. Forced to wear oversized clothing similar to smocks without pockets, enslaved women outsmarted the system by repurposing cotton, tobacco, and flour sacks to create secret pockets worn beneath their clothing. These simple pockets became a way to reclaim bodily autonomy and became a major threat to the system. You see, pockets were essential to helping our people escape. Fearful that our resourceful ancestors might use them to carry papers and other necessary items, enslavers put out ads for escaped people using pockets as identifying markers. Pockets evolved into purses, sacks, and suitcases, sometimes called freedom bags, during the Great Migration aboard segregated trains headed north. Today, this Black innovation is weaponized against us, particularly in policing, with cases like 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who in 2014 had his hands tucked in his pockets before police shot him. Coloniality tries to limit us in every way possible, but we must never let it. We can imagine new things and turn them into reality.
Well, hello. How are you doing today, Kimberly?
Hi, good. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. Super excited for today's conversation. But before we dive deep into this rich history related to the legacy of Black fashion, I got a bit of a game for you if you indulge us. Essentially, I'm going to read off some statements and you just let us know how they land with true or false. How does that sound?
Sounds good. I'm ready.
True or false, Kimberly? Mary J. Blige could have had her own boot line.
True.
True or false, Kimberly? The recent movement of Black men marching in suits is rooted in respectability politics.
No, false.
Okay. True or false, Kimberly? Black style is often considered ghetto till proven fashionable by the high art world.
True.
True or false, Kimberly? All white parties for Black folks is a spiritual experience.
True.
True or false, Kimberly? The tall tee can be considered the African-American dashiki.
Yes, in certain regions. I feel like it was kind of regional.
Yes, yeah. Long white t-shirts, basic white tee, but it came down to the knees.
Yeah. I don't know if it's true, so I'm going to say false, but it could be true.
Okay. True or false, Kimberly? White people should not wear dashikis.
That is true.
Copy. True or false, Kimberly? Black Americans can't appropriate traditional African garb.
Black Americans can't appropriate traditional... Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, I would say true for some, in defense of people who are very passionate about that, like from the continent, because I know that there can be issues with that. I don't think that someone should just freely, if you don't fully understand the culture. So I'm going to go with true.
True or false, Kimberly? Fascist movements like the alt-right often use fashion as an organizing tool.
Yes, true.
True or false, Kimberly? Black fashion can help us imagine what it feels to be free.
True.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you so much for your rich responses. With that said, we want to know from your perspective, Kimberly, what does Black liberation mean to you?
Whew, what does Black liberation mean? So I'm seeing this as a Black American woman. True liberation to me would feel like moving through the world where the things we wear, the way we present ourselves, the things we buy, just various things we do, don't hinge on acceptance or validation from whiteness. Imagining a world right now, I've just never been able to imagine a world where we haven't. I mean, shout out to all the Black people who have been living their whole lives never feeling the need for validation. But the long-standing impact of white supremacy really has seeped in. It's insidious in many of the things that we do. And so true liberation is not only involving reparations, giving us what we're owed, it's also not feeling like you need to be validated by whiteness. But we'll get into that, hopefully, when we talk about fashion, logos, brands, and luxury and stuff like that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that rich response, especially tying back into your response to our true or false question, whether or not Black adornment can help us feel liberated. Absolutely. I often think about how do we move in such a way where we're not thinking about the white gaze? And essentially, that seems to be a through line across so many folks' responses to what it means to be liberated in a Black body, in a Black world. Thank you for pointing out how fashion can help lead us to that. Just to kind of set the foundation for us today. Very curious at a very high level, Kimberly, why are we talking about fashion and power? What is the importance of this particular topic? Why is it so often dismissed as frivolous? And why are they potentially wrong?
First, starting with why fashion. Over a decade ago, I went into a graduate program at Parsons School of Design, a master's program called Fashion Studies. It is a nascent field where we talk about the intellectual, philosophical, political aspects of fashion, which until just a couple of decades ago wasn't really considered a formal or serious course of study. It's either you go into fashion design or there's fashion history, but there's no why. There's like what we wear, design, when we wore something, history, but not the why of this intellectual aspect. For over a decade now, after graduating and teaching, being a professor at various institutions and doing the work I do, has been sort of evangelizing this idea that there's deeper meaning to why we wear what we wear. There's psychological aspects, economic aspects, and a lot of what the work I've become known for, the racial aspects. And so fashion is political because it's personal also, and the personal is political. And I can't tell you how many people over the last few years, well, almost a decade, whenever I go out and speak to people about this, even at like a dinner party or something, I'll speak to, say, a lawyer or a doctor, and I talk about what I study, and they are just kind of dismissing it right off the bat. And then next thing you know, after we get into a deep conversation, they realize, wow, I never thought you could think about fashion in that way. They just wrote me off as, oh, you're into trends and models and logos and things like that. And then I start talking to them about, well, let's talk about what you're wearing and why you wear it. And even in your field, in law or medicine, what clothing and identity and presentation has to do with it. They realize, oh, okay, this does implicate everybody.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Do you think it's almost like a function of patriarchy as to why the average person's understanding of fashion is that it's somewhat frivolous?
Yeah. So that's the cornerstone of what we talk about in fashion studies. Right out the gate, we acknowledge that much of the reason why fashion is dismissed as a serious course of study is because of the gender aspect. It's considered associated with femininity, which has been associated with frivolity. Oh, that's just a feminine preoccupation or an interest. There's a moral and taste aspect to it also. So if you go back a couple of centuries, writers and poets and people in the sciences thinking that a preoccupation with design and fashion or standing out or being a little too loud was kind of a person who cannot or should not be taken seriously, that someone who is of a sober mind is wearing, darker clothes, you don't have colored hair, and you just look and present yourself a certain way. Women considered loose if you're wearing a lipstick color like what I'm wearing right now, like something red, or, that's associated with prostitution perhaps back then and things like that. So things that are associated with fashion, and we see this today in various fields where it is frowned upon in certain industries to stand out or look a little too flashy or a little too fashionable. You don't want to do that because there's this assumption that it's taking away from the intellectual aspects, the moral aspects, and things like that. And then finally, there's also, when it comes to taste and class, you can also argue at some level, from a class standpoint, being very flashy or too fashionable is considered, kind of vulgar. And so, for instance, one of the micro trends we've seen in the past year, quiet luxury, it's all about being subdued and not being you're fashionable, but you're more stylish. There's more of a premium placed on style. Style is a little smarter, if you will, because it's about what you make of something. You take the high, you take the low, you put something together. But the slavish person to fashion is considered vulgar or tacky, just goes to a store, looks at the mannequin and just has no mind of their own. They just follow whatever is the trend. So there's just all those layers when it comes to taste, class, morality, gender. All this stuff is loaded as soon as you say that F word. Like, I'm into fashion. And people know this, all these things that we're talking about, that in the subconscious of their minds. And so they're just already writing you off.
Oh my gosh. So many jewels you just dropped for us there. Let me see if I could just hold on to one. I love that you mentioned this relationship between class and taste, this notion of vulgarity associated with stylish dress, stylish adornment. Makes me think of the reaction to Sha'Carri Richardson. Do you feel like that provides a good example to think about that relationship?
100%. I've been watching the way her style has evolved. I think in the public forum, people didn't know what to do with a girl from Dallas, where I'm from, also, just with someone who, oh my gosh, she's wearing this colored hair that's obviously a wig, and it's not a natural hair color. Kind of going back to what I was saying about like femininity and style, or the unnatural. We have this vestige from the past of something that looks too unnatural, the idea of wearing something that's too unnatural. Your nails are too long, your hair is obviously not naturally orange. Those are seen as this kind of moral deficiency. Why do you behave like that? Why do you wear that? That's improper. So people not knowing what to do with her. And, when she's making these decisions, she's coming out of Black traditions of changing your hair and enjoying the agency and being able to kind of switch it up and play with it. She's having fun with it. She's doing it and changing it up because she can. And so she has to kind of defend all of that, though. She, along with all the other women who participate in this kind of liberating form of dress. You have to defend yourself from the respectability politics police. So it's not just people within your own community who are the respectability police, but also just outsiders from a racial perspective who are just seeing you as a racial stereotype.
Absolutely. This all reminds me of the importance behind your fashion and race database. Before we move forward, we just want to know, what was the inspiration behind the fashion and race database? What are its intentions? And what do you hope folks receive from the database?
Yeah, the quickest backstory is I was teaching at Parsons School of Design for about 7 years. In 2016, 2017, I was rolling out a course called Fashion and Race, which had become very popular at the time on campus. I really struggled with having a framework for, how do we think about fashion and race? What does fashion and race mean? What does it entail? And so I built a framework for myself and just kind of built a website where I started collecting books and articles and podcasts and exhibitions, everything that was looking into all these scholars from the past decades, curators, people who were having these conversations about the intersections of race, aesthetics, power, the politics of skin color, colorism, discrimination, cultural appropriation, all these things, and just pulling all this together into a website. And then this is, again, like 2017. And then by 2020 and 2021, I got some funding and I was a proper web developer, and we were able to build it into a full formal platform. So if anyone goes to fashionrace.org right now, it's kind of a fusion of a fashion publication and an academic institution that's teaching you about fashion and race. For the past couple of years, we also license it to universities and museums around the world. We've got universities, colleges, and museums that have it inside their libraries for their students and pay us to license it because they find it that valuable for their students and faculty.
Thank you so much for lifting it up. Thank you so much for your work and your research to this stage. We deeply appreciate it. So now we're about to do a little bit of a tour through history, thinking about Black fashion and political agency. Some may call it resistance. With that said, we learned a very interesting term during our check-in with you, Kimberly. You told us about Negro cloth. Can you share with us some of the restrictive clothing laws imposed on enslaved persons in this country?
Well, just to name one, there was the Negro Act of 1735 and slave codes in 1740 in South Carolina. They were literally putting in these documents the limitations of what Black people in the 18th and 19th century could wear and what they couldn't wear. One umbrella term that was used back then for clothes reserved for enslaved Black people is called Negro cloth. Any of our listeners can look it up and they'll find themselves down a rabbit hole of, I can't believe they called it this. But it was an umbrella term for some of the worst textile and material. Just think of something that's kind of scratchy, the opposite of what slave owners and people on plantations were able to wear. They're wearing all the finery. And so the clothing that was reserved for enslaved people was of the Negro cloth variety. Durable because you're working in the fields, you're tilling, you're working in the house. And so they need it to just be the most basic uniform clothing. It is not designed to make you feel good about yourself or feel comfortable. It is just there to last as long as it possibly can and patch it up maybe. So there were those restrictions. And for people at that time, for any agency they did have, being able to have little side jobs and pull money together, they could buy nice garments or pieces of clothing for themselves whenever they would gather, maybe on a Sunday for worship or just gathering in community. It was not made for you to stand out. Fast forward from that era to today, we still see the importance of uniforms used to distinguish between the people in power and the people who are made to be invisible. When you're even seeing around you, if you go to any institution or you see people in a certain service position or even, of course, in prisons, they're wearing something that's either, in prison systems designed to be able to spot you and identify you. But in places of service, you're just supposed to blend. You're just supposed to blend into the background. It is not to stand out and feel distinguished.
You mentioned Sunday adornment for church services during the antebellum period. What other ways did enslaved people use or modify their clothing as a form of resistance or to at least assert individuality or try to challenge their status?
Yeah. So, I think in answering this question, I want to bring up two important scholars, one of them who's a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Square. I have learned much of what I've learned about specifically 18th and 19th century dress and liberation strategies of enslaved people through my friend, Dr. Jonathan Michael Square. He has a digital humanities project, a website and Instagram and Facebook account called Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom. He focuses solely on teaching us about the different ways that enslaved people would be wearing Negro cloth or certain styles of dress, but also using any moment they can to kind of buck the system a little bit through maybe a head wrap, being a little idiosyncratic with how they're styling their hair or their head wrap or any clothing they can get their hands on. So I actually would tell people, go follow him because he gives you just every single day an amazing post about all the examples that you're asking about. Also, coincidentally, recently his friend and colleague, Seth Rockman, a labor historian at Brown University. He has a new book out called Plantation Goods, and it talks about the connection between slavery and clothing. I found it so illuminating because he goes into great detail in this book talking about the textile industry in the Northeast, especially around Massachusetts, which was a major textile hub for making clothing for enslaved people. What you had was slave owners from the South coming up as retail buyers, making a special trip to New York, Pennsylvania, or Massachusetts and saying, look, I've got some slaves. I got a plantation. Here's the names. These are people ranging from 12 years old to 50 years old. Professor Seth Rockman, I mean, he went through all the records that show all the enslaved people's names, their age, their measurements. He even captured photos. And so, you'd have these people in textile mills. What's perverse and paradoxical about all this is this industry to make clothing for enslaved people in the South was giving jobs to women, creating this freedom for some people, because it was like such a bursting industry to make clothing for slaves. And then you've got the slave owners going there, buying the clothing. They're very particular about what they're getting, and then they're bringing it down and having the people wear it. Coming back to your question with that, this is all tying together. If there's any modicum of agency that these enslaved people had in the South with the clothing that these owners were buying for them, the enslaved people were able to say, look, this outfit just fell apart after a month, or this was trash, basically, or like, you need to go back. And so then it starts becoming this relationship where they're letting their owners know, like, can you not ever use that material again? Or, hey, we need this and this. And even more, you would have enslaved people saying, the other enslaved people on that plantation look a lot better than we do. And so these owners, not to be shown up by their other white counterparts, they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to go get something so that my enslaved people look better. So that's, in some ways, that was a way for enslaved people to feel like, okay, I have a say in this. I get to comment on the fit, the feel of it. And so, I mean, that's part of our history. For those of us who come from enslaved ancestors, I mean, they're just living their lives while we get to enjoy wearing clothes that fit us and we feel good. And these are people who were wearing things that were ridiculous sometimes, maybe, if the stitching was just thrown together. So I think taking this further of what this did, this is the critical scholarship that's needed to prove the claim that Black people literally built the fashion industry. Between enslaved people being able to work with their owners about how things look, that's kind of shaping how future enslaved people were wearing clothing. But also, I don't want to lose my train of thought. So enslaved people also, through this research, we find that enslaved people, just right up there with soldiers who fought in the Civil War, were critical in creating or necessitating standardized clothing. So that's what we mean in that Black people really off the backs of enslaved people built the fashion and textile industry, because you had so many soldiers fighting in the Civil War, because you had so many people enslaved. If you got to churn out a lot of clothing, you start thinking, we need to standardize this. Okay, if we have a bunch of 12-year-olds or 16-year-olds or 24-year-olds, we need to figure out, like, what's a standardized size. Even standardized sizes and clothing measurements that we have to this day, it is really, kind of a descendant of 18th and 19th century technologies. It really just comes from having to figure out, how do we clothe all these soldiers? How do we clothe all these slaves? So.
Okay. For our listeners, folks who aren't able to see us right now, my jaw has been on the floor. Thank you so much for laying that out.
When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof like Aloe, Allbirds, or Skims, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet, and the not-so-secret secret, with Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned, and way more sales going. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell whenever your customers are scrolling or strolling on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout experience as business powerhouses like Aloe, Allbirds, and Skims. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/Odyssey Podcast, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Odyssey Podcast to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/Odyssey Podcast.
Now I want to switch gears and move to another historical period. We want to think about the Harlem Renaissance. I'm curious, Kimberly, how did the Harlem Renaissance influence Black fashion and style throughout the 20s and the 30s?
By the 1920s, you have a greater democratization of dress, the new materials that were coming out, the technologies, the styles, music, film, all of these things are kind of working together. And this has been happening for maybe a couple of decades where you can just go into a department store and buy clothing. It just unleashes all these new possibilities of how you can dress, like all these new materials and colors and embellishments. And so, I mean, in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, you've got Black people during that time putting their flavor to it, just enjoying much of the clothing that was available, especially if we're talking about New York. Hats were particularly popular. Headwear was particularly popular. So if there's a cloche hat that's popular at that time, or beaded headdresses or scarves, they are maybe drawing from the African heritage they're exploring now at this point, because now literature is even more popular. People are able to travel just a little bit and get their hands on things. When it comes to dress and the democratization of dress, being able to go into stores around Harlem and shop, you've got Black people, especially Black people, entering the leisure class and wanting to show it. They are taking advantage of materiality and color and what was considered luxury goods at that time to really show off how much money they have. Some images that may come to mind are James Van Der Zee photographs of like a man in a hat and a fur coat. Yes, the fur coat, and women in just like these gorgeous dresses. But, but there's layers to it. There's different classes there. So you've got people who have access to more resources that are able to really be conspicuous and show off with that style of dress. Even back then, I'm sure there were Black people who were like, I don't want to be that flashy because I'm an intellectual, So I think you also had people in the Harlem Renaissance who were like, I could do that, but I'm not, I'm gonna be subdued, and I want to show them that I'm an intellectual. I'm more into my literature. I'm not gonna wear all the flashy things. So that's how I would characterize it. It was just a creature of the era. They had all the things that many, I don't want to say everything everyone had at that time, like their white counterparts, but many of those things they had as a way to start fashioning, if you will, their identities, considering how do I want to identify gender-wise, sexuality-wise, all of that. How do I want to style myself? The difference then, as opposed to oh my gosh, like half a century before that, I mean, it was just what a joyous time. I'm sure they were just living their best lives at that time, just thinking, I can dress like this, I can wear this. They could really kind of play with how they wanted to present themselves into society.
Ooh-wee. Okay. I got a big question about the relationship between the new Negro movement and the chosen styles of adornment during this time. So, Garveyism is coming up. You mentioned a lot of the class persons during the Harlem Renaissance who were able to kind of obtain different materials, different styles and whatnot. Do you think there's a relationship between budding political movements and chosen styles of adornment? Is that somehow connected to some sort of political ethos, you think? Can we witness this during this period of the Harlem Renaissance?
I honestly believe that Black people were just like we are today. You had people who were influenced by Marcus Garvey. I'm certain you had Black people who were like, I'm not dressing like that. I'm not associating with that. It's almost like those classic debates that were also happening around that time between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, like, where do you stand? What camp are you in? And so at that time, I think many of these people in the intellectual class, the political class, like W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, they're keenly aware, and Marcus Garvey, they're keenly aware of their presentation, and it's very intentional of how they want to present. Do you want to present yourself as more assimilated into whiteness and, just like, look, you want to seem non-threatening, or do you want to really lean into saying, no, I'm Black, this is who I am. This is what I want to wear. I mean, I actually love that era. I mean, 1930s, in that whole interwar period, it was just so fascinating because we could talk for days about the styles, then thinking about the spiritual movements that were coming out about that time. You've got the Moors, the new Moors that were coming out, which is a whole kind of subculture. Well, I don't want to say call it a subculture, but it was like these mystical religions that are coming out at that time, like Noble Drew Ali. He was wearing like this kind of like turban, and then there was like a fez hat they were wearing. And it was just very kind of like this amalgamation of like Africanness, even though Africa is a continent. It was just this interest in like Egypt. We're going to take a little bit of Egyptian style. We're going to take a little bit of what we consider Arab style. We're going to take some elements of Americanness. So even with those styles you had happening then, that was a liberation movement so different from W.E.B. Du Bois and so different from the people you would see in James Vanderbeek, so different from Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. Everyone is just so different, but knowing exactly who they are and just trying to think through how hairstyling, adornment, colors, the silhouette of what they're wearing, the materials all mattered as tools at that time for expressing their identity.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay. When I think about the soul era and the birth of the civil rights movement, while doing some research, our producers came across two interesting tactics related to adornment and fashion to kind of signify certain political ideals during this time. I'm curious, what do you make of these two kind of diverging approaches, appropriating the fashion of the privileged? So one approach was deemed the Black Ivy approach. I have some research here for us from Jason Jules and Graham Marsh, who wrote Black Ivy, Revolt in Style.
Do you have your fashion library?
Yeah, just a little bit, trying to get like y'all. But yeah, so there's the Black Ivy approach, but also there was the denim overalls approach, where Black folks participating in the civil rights movement adorned denim overalls to kind of signify their solidarity with the exploited worker. Just curious, what do you think about those approaches?
Yes, I think they were critical during that period. It's a snapshot. Oftentimes, half century, decades later, when we look back, people living during that time, even my father, who was living in was actually right in the thick of that civil rights era. We look back on these, and these were significant movements that were happening during that time. But then you also had a lot of Black people who weren't in either camp. They were just dressing. They were just like wearing whatever. It was just everyday life for them. But what we remember in history is these major styles and moments. And so for Black Ivy, or even kind of more respectability politics, we've had HBCUs in existence for decades at this point. So being educated at this time, a half century into the 20th century, it was so important how you were regarded in society because there was so much at stake. So you had one camp that was thinking, with everything at stake, it's important that you press your hair, straighten it, wear a hat, wear a nice dress, wear some heels, put on some makeup. Men, gentlemen, wear a hat, wear a suit, you'll be taken seriously, you'll look educated. All of that was just very critical because they felt that there was so much at stake. But then you also had the working class, especially with what you're signaling, like these student activists, part of SNCC at that time, by the 1960s, wanting to show their solidarity with the workers and the farmers. They're going out and marching in jeans or overalls to show their solidarity. So it's like two things happen. You've got students wearing it to show their solidarity, and then there's these people who are living it, blue collar workers, farmers, who are wearing these clothes just by necessity. So you got like these like high-end respectability politics people, wealthy Black individuals by this point. And then you have people in between wearing, whatever they feel like they need to wear to just get by.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm not even sure if I have this periodization correct, but it seems like by the end of the 1960s, there seemed to be a bit of a shift, kind of culturally, socially, politically, and definitely sartorially. I'm thinking about the rise of the Black is Beautiful movement. And I guess what I want to ask, Kimberly, is what do you think of the significance of the rising Afrocentric fashion during this time? Do you think it was explicitly kind of formed to kind of fight back against, I guess, Eurocentric beauty standards? How would you characterize this moment, the Black is Beautiful movement?
When it comes to the Black is Beautiful movement, it is important to note that it was founded by AJASS, which is an acronym, AJASS. It was the African Jazz Art Society and Studios movement. And oftentimes, actually, I've been in contact over the years by an elder from that community who really wants to make sure that that is first made clear, because oftentimes, and this isn't to take away from his legacy, but Kwame Brathwaite, who was a photographer at that time, who made it popular, oftentimes he is called the founder of it, or he was a founding member of it. And so oftentimes AJASS just gets like pushed out of history, or gets, a lot of people don't even know what that is, or that they actually started. They were a collective. So I guess I just want to start there. And Kwame Brathwaite really took the baton as a member and made it visual, like really created all of these just amazing images from it. And so many times when people start, if you were to look up Black is Beautiful, you're probably seeing some of Kwame's photographs of all these Black women who were wearing kind of Afrocentric, quote unquote, dress, which was kind of this amalgamation of, especially for Black Americans, not quite certain where we came from. It's sort of like, I think this is, I think these motifs represent Africanness and these colors represent, kind of like dashikis, where you had a lot of people on the continent thinking, that's not a thing, or well, that's not our dress, or what is that? Like, where did you come up with that? But they're trying, because, we're just trying to figure out where we came from, and we don't want to be enslaved to kind of these Eurocentric and white beauty standards. So at least it's, it was just earnest effort, that was happening at that time. And so women wearing these afros. And so another name I want to lift up in this is another colleague of mine, Dr. Tanisha C. Ford, who is kind of a bridge between what we just talked about and what we're talking about now. She wrote a book called Liberated Threads about the importance of dress in protest movements, especially like SNCC and wearing overalls and things like that. And so she's written at length about the importance of that and denim wear in the 1960s. And then she's also written about Ajaz and the whole Black is Beautiful movement. There was a reading I would always use of hers, a chapter from her book that I would use in my fashion and race course that was just so illuminating, which kind of, I'm not trying to put a damper on the Black is Beautiful movement, but it just adds a lot of honesty and complexity to it. And that is that the irony in this Black is Beautiful movement was just that there were so many prescriptions of what a good Black woman should look like. They wanted a certain kind of model, like she needed to be like this certain dark skin. And if you were too light skinned, you didn't fit that, or your hair can't be too loosely curled. We want it to be like a tight afro. So it's kind of like we're doing this Black movement, but then it's also coming with this checklist of standards or this archetype of what they're trying to create as the perfect or ideal Black with a capital B woman. So that was really, I found that really interesting. Something that was meant to be liberating is now coming with its own list of like, you got to look like this, you got to look like, oh, you're not quite Black enough. And of course, judgment too. I'm sure during this era it becomes divisive too, with this finger wagging of, oh, you're pressing your hair, that makes you less Black. Why are you looking like that? These issues where, especially from a gender perspective, the people who are on the losing end of this is women. Just like you've got these prescriptions of what the right Black woman should look like. And so now you've got all this arguing about like, well, you're not being Black enough. And don't you care about where you come from? So I imagine there was a great deal of exhaustion and eye rolling also happening at that time, along with the empowerment. So I think the Black is Beautiful movement was so important and beautiful, but it also is unfortunate that, what comes with it is just kind of these aesthetic demands of what Blackness is supposed to look like. And it doesn't leave a lot of room for any flexibility of how you want to look to get by in a racist society, a white supremacist patriarchal society.
Yes, indeed. But it also makes me think about how essentializing aesthetics has functioned throughout many different periods and social movements, the kind of prescriptive nature that it tends to give us. And it makes me think about the Black Panther Party and their style of adornment and how it's somehow kind of informed certain tropes within organizing spaces with regards to how a radical or revolutionary should adorn themselves, how they should kind of appear on the front lines, things of that nature. I'm just curious from your perspective, Kimberly, what can you share with us about how the Panthers use fashion to kind of create a visual identity to convey their own political message?
Yes. Well, this look that they had assembled, it's not limited to this, but it's most well known for this. And that was that on both ends of the gender spectrum, there was this Afro hairstyle that was really critical, kind of like what we were talking about with the Black is Beautiful movement. If we're going to talk about distancing yourself from white supremacist aesthetics, that involves wearing your hair in its natural state. The more tightly curled, the better. The closer you are to the essence, it's just kind of a black and white uniform. The leather jacket adds this element of coolness. I'm sure it was also practical to wear. The beret pulling from these archetypal objects, fashion objects of rebellion and resistance from other cultures. So, adopting the beret, which has been used across various cultures when it comes to resistance. The buttons that they would wear, kind of like stickers, are just a great, cheap and mobile way to communicate what your party's name is or what it's about. If you can't get a leather jacket or anything else, you can at least wear a button. So everyone can just wear that and carry that around. The sunglasses, in my research, it's been not just about coolness. It's also kind of like today how they use masks, masking your identity, being able to be inconspicuous. Coolness is just kind of like an afterthought, but you've got all of those different elements happening together, and then the gestures, the comportment, just standing tall and strong, arms folded, standing proud, raising the fist for Black Power. All of that together really made for an impactful presentation. Very intimidating in the best way.
Gearing up for holiday shopping? Introducing Klarna, a smarter way to spend. Klarna has a new cashback program where you actually get rewarded for shopping. Plus, you can split your purchases into 4 payments with 0 interest. It's like having a smart, flexible shopping buddy, making your holiday gift buying easier. Choose Klarna at your favorite retailers or shop now at Klarna.com.
California resident loans made or arranged pursuant to a California finance law license. NMLS number 1353190. Klarna balance account required. Klarna may get a commission. Limitations, terms, and conditions apply.
We're about to move into our present day section, but before we get to the questions, I got another game for you. It's a simple word association game. I'm just going to read off some names of certain brands, some fashion icons, some moments related to fashion, and you just let us know whatever words you associate with those terms. Okay? All right. So first up, Karl Kani.
Ooh, I mean, I just think of 90s fashion hip hop videos and everyone wearing it and how important that was.
Yes. Ghetto Fabulous.
A term of endearment, kind of like this reclaiming. It's like thumbing your nose at respectability and just wearing the flashy thing, feeling proud of what you're wearing, even if it makes people uncomfortable, but it's definitely intentional and comes from some sort of tradition, from your culture, identity, or community.
Yes. Gold teeth.
I think of the South, coming from the South, you have Juvenile and others wearing gold teeth. We see it everywhere. It's made a comeback now with these hipster girls wearing gold teeth. Earlier, it was just like these grills, just really fabulous. Like taking something that was worn by necessity by some people who couldn't afford a natural looking tooth and then turning it into something that is used as a form of adornment and just kind of anti-fashion.
Ooh, love that. Okay. The artist formerly known as Prince's assless chaps.
How did I know you were going to say that? As soon as you said Prince, I was like, this is going towards assless chaps, I'm sure. I mean, I just think of the awards and everyone clutching their pearls. What do you expect from someone who is just as bold and audacious as Prince? I think of a Missy Elliott song where references it towards the end of one of her songs. I just think of someone who is very proud and standing true in their identity when they do that.
Love it. Grace Jones.
Ahead of their time. I honestly think there were always Black people loving her in the past decades, but I feel like only in the past decade has she really been getting her flowers, especially with which this is a whole other separate conversation, the internalized wars of Black aesthetics, especially with women in the 80s and 90s and shaming darker skinned women who didn't have long, soft hair. I mean, there was just like these preferences, these aesthetic preferences that I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s, where women who didn't fit into this quote unquote beautiful archetype of Black women were just seen as unattractive, primitive character. I mean, even as, Grace Jones in the film Boomerang with Eddie Murphy, they're just always this kind of lusty or, they're not always positioned as the love interest. But now I feel like she and Whoopi Goldberg are getting their flowers for how beautiful they've always been and just like how ahead of their time they were back then, standing in their truth. But people weren't ready for that. People just were not ready for that. And now it seems in the 21st century, as our perspective has widened and we're understanding aesthetics in more nuanced, more sophisticated ways, we're realizing, oh, wow, Grace Jones was just really ahead of her time.
Absolutely. Okay, this one's a bit heavy, but I think it's important to think about in the context of this conversation. Nancy Pelosi kneeling in kente cloth.
Oh my gosh. I think one word that comes to a lot of people's minds is performativity. The intention was solidarity, but some things can go wrong when it comes to certain groups within political parties where it's this kind of like, oh, we're all one and we're all together and let's all just wear this. It just doesn't come off It just doesn't seem very authentic. But again, there's a lot of Black people who were very moved by it and thought, oh, this is wonderful, and thank you for reaching into our culture and doing this. But I just wasn't a huge fan of it.
Yes, indeed. Okay, last one, Kimberly. FUBU.
Sort of like Karl Kani. I mean, I think of the 90s for sure. Kind of this Renaissance era. I think if I were to talk about Karl Kani and FUBU, and even just a shout out to Alice Walker also to bring women into the conversation in streetwear, it was just such, I felt like I grew up in the best time in the 90s. It's like you had FUBU happening, and then you've got Karl Kani and Cross Colors, and you've got John Singleton films and F. Gary Gray. We had the best athlete, everything was just Black. I know some people hate the phrase Black excellence, but it just felt like such a renaissance, from fashion to film to music. It was this kind of community. Everyone was really bringing it at that time, and it was all just very pro-Black.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, that leads us right into our next section to think about the hip-hop generation. With that said, you were present during this time. How would you describe the shift in styling and adornment emerging out of hip-hop's birth, and also the culture you just described, this time of Black excellence?
It's interesting, again, putting my fashion history hat on. You had two pivotal and lasting art forms and aesthetics coming out in the mid to late 70s. Hip hop and punk. Both of them just have a lasting impression in styling to this day, and certain fashion items that we wear. For hip hop, you have to break it up regionally, but if we were to come from the birth of hip hop in the Northeast and around the Bronx, you had a couple of things happening at the same time. They're wearing what's of the era in the 1970s and moving into this new decade, the 80s. So you had people just kind of wearing whatever the popular brands were at that time, the different styles for men and women, and then putting their own flavor to it also. So depending on what borough or neighborhood you're in, some people had an affinity for a certain denim wear brand or a certain footwear brand, just like today. Still people get very siloed of oh, we never wear that brand, we only wear this brand. Same as back then. And jewelry, you just have this evolution of gold jewelry that's being worn in different ways and becoming foundational to this art form. It's also hinging on practicality. So if hip hop was about breakdancing and graffiti, depending on, what you're physically doing, breakdancing on the ground or in subway tunnels, doing graffiti or out in the streets, you're wearing things also to just purely to protect yourself from the elements. You're wearing jeans and clothes that facilitate that. So it ends up part of the hip hop style. And so moving into the 80s, then you start, especially Run DMC with My Adidas, LL Cool J with Kangol hats, you just have this brand recognition happening, which wasn't different from what was happening if you open the lens up to what was just happening in the 80s, where it was about logomania. You have people outside of hip hop culture. It was just popular broadly to start wearing logos and different brands. By the 70s, we start to see globalizations where designers are starting to become big. They're creating labels and getting larger business-wise. And so they're starting to outsource. And so it starts to become profitable to create just the most basic, simple clothes at that time. So, if you're a certain designer and you're realizing that your name is really making waves, you're just thinking, what else can I slap my name on? So that's how we're starting to see t-shirts, sweatshirts, anything that was maybe cheaply outsourced and made with a label on it. Those things become very affordable for all these people in these spaces. So if you couldn't afford a fully luxury brand outfit, you could surely get the sweatpants or the t-shirt or the sweatshirt that says that luxury brand name on it. And so that starts getting worn, and then you start seeing it in music videos eventually. People are thinking, oh, they're wearing that? I love their music. Well, I guess I should be wearing that. And so that really starts to kind of shape it. It's the people and the musicians, and it's luxury brands, but also people, especially Black and brown people at this time, still making political decisions. They're very aware of brands, even in that era, who really cares about us? Do we really want to wear these brands? So some of them are also making decisions of, I'm not wearing this brand or I'm not wearing this label, but I will wear this. So it's interesting. So then by the 90s, you really start to see logomania and brand awareness happening. At that time in the 90s, I listened to a lot of hip hop as a kid growing up and developed kind of a sophisticated palette of hip hop music at that time. And so you had these other camps of rappers or hip hop artists who were just very unimpressed. They were not interested in being slaves to fashion and wearing logos and brands. And so they thought, kind of like Harlem Renaissance, like, I'm intellectual. I'm not into that flavor of hip hop music. This is how I rap. I went to college and I work and I read this. And so I don't need to wear a logo to validate myself, or I wear my hair like this because I don't need to adhere to respectability politics. So you really start in the 90s seeing hip hop music fragmenting in various ways when it comes to just different aesthetics and belief systems. How do we want to dress? What are we really saying as Black people with what we wear? Do we really want to wear all these logos and brands? And then you've got some rappers and hip hop artists who are like, yes, I do. I want to paint it all over my body. I want to wear their jewelry. I want to wear all of it. I want to go to all the parties. So it's really interesting what you start seeing happening through the 80s and 90s when it comes to what signifies hip hop dress. It's hard to pinpoint, especially by the late 80s and throughout the 90s. The diffusion of hip hop and the culture hitting the West Coast, the South. I mean, everyone just starts from their own, they start blending their cultural surroundings, just even the environmental elements. They all start integrating that into their own hip hop styles. When you're on the West Coast, you don't need to wear bubble jackets. They're just wearing a whole different style of clothing that's maybe more cotton based and cooler. And then it's also coming from integrations with Mexican communities there. So it's just all starting to like cross pollinate. And so if we were to like in the quickest conversation talk about hip hop style, it becomes such a mosaic because it starts, I guess people would argue in the Bronx, they would say that's where it came from. But then once it diffuses, you have different mentalities and politics of people who want to get into hip hop culture approaching it. It just really is beautiful how it plays out. And it still is to this day. Now it's a global phenomenon. So, which
we could absolutely have a whole nother conversation. How do you respond to folks who claim, especially with the history of the 90s and the 80s that you just laid out, the intense kind of branding, logos, brand idealization? How do you respond to folks who claim that Black folks' sartorial sensibilities are signs of consumerism? People who claim that Black folks wear their money. There's always the evergreen conversation around Black people and Jordans. How do you respond to that?
It's a very myopic thing, a very limiting conversation because Black people are not a monolith. I mean, no, I don't think that our dress practices come from consumerism any more than everyone else. Sort of like what I was saying with hip hop culture, you have Black people who are just minimalists even back in the 90s, you're not into shopping or interested in labels and things like that. And then you have people who really find it critical for social mobility. 50 years before all that, when you start seeing the birth of marketing and PR happening, especially by the 1950s, when it really becomes a sophisticated mechanism for shaping our minds and what we like. Everything is an ad. It's marketing us to look a certain way and wear a certain thing. It's reaching everybody, white audiences, Black audiences. The nuance is that race and class, depending on where you get categorized, if you were a racialized person or where you fall in the class system, consumerism means something very different depending on where you are in those spectrums. One of the things I like to talk about when I teach fashion theory, which is general conversations about why we wear what we wear, is about distinction and this inclination to everyone wants to kind of distinguish themselves. Even kind of like that famous scene in The Devil Wears Prada, when you think you don't have anything to do with fashion, yes, you do. Everyone is implicated in this, even people who don't care about fashion. When it comes to consumerism, everyone, when it comes to distinction, is either, you're striving towards something, you're aspiring towards something, and clothing is just one of many tools to get there and express that, or you're working against it. You're still acknowledging it, but you're working against it. You're also working to distinguish yourself in society by saying, I don't care about fashion, and I want to show you by the way I wear my hair, the clothes I wear. I have a uniform style because I don't even care about changing it up. Everyone is reacting to fashion and wanting to distinguish themselves. Either way, it depends on if you've been racialized or gendered in a certain way or your class position. That's just another layer of trying to figure out, how do I want to express this? Like, you're making a negotiation every day. Oh my gosh, okay, I got to walk out the door tomorrow. I'm racialized, I'm Black, so I'm going to wear my hair like this because I don't want to deal with this, or I want to look attractive, or I want to defy stereotypes. I'm going to wear these shoes instead of sneakers because people already expect me to wear sneakers. But the consumption habits are all shaped by how we've been categorized in various ways, even though we don't ask to be categorized. And so now you got to just work through this and make all these daily negotiations, which is at the heart of why I'm a fashion scholar and talking about this and why these are conversations to be had at an intellectual level, because every day we're making these negotiations. And whether you like to accept it or not, you are making decisions.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Okay. There's so much rich stuff to touch upon. Right now, I'm thinking about a contemporary kind of social justice issue, cultural appropriation. How we all are kind of positioned within this kind of hegemonic colonial matrix, and how that presents some challenges in kind of negotiating certain fashion choices for some identities. Explicitly right now, I'm thinking about the South Korean hip hop scene and their style of dress and adornment. And what I want to ask you, Kimberly, is when does cultural appreciation turn into cultural appropriation, especially when thinking about the adoption of Black fashion and styles by other identities?
I feel like that's the question. I know for myself in the field of fashion studies, we started talking about that 12 or 13 years ago, and we still, it's still something people wring their hands over because it's so personal. The short answer, if I were to give one word, it's sacredness. Ooh. So, if anyone, there's a colleague of mine, Susan Scafidi, who founded the Fashion Law Institute at Fordham University. Over 20 years ago, she published a book called Who Owns Culture? One thing she came up with many years ago was the 3 S's. I would always tell my students to keep these 3 S's in your back pocket. And that is source, significance, and similarity. Source meaning, especially when I was teaching design students, if you were looking at something, can you identify the source? If you can't, maybe stop right there. Do you even know where this came from? Do you know the source? And then significance. How sacred is it? How significant is it? Before you wear that hairstyle, that jewelry, that garment, do you know if it has a sacred significance? Or is it open? Is it something that the culture would say, no, wear it, please, it's open? Or does it have some religious or deeply political issue with it to where only the people in that community should be wearing it? And if you are not inside that community, you have no business wearing it. And then the last similarity is thinking about, if I wear this exactly the way it's supposed to be worn, maybe that's supposed to be respectful. But if I don't, like say I decide to switch it up, would changing it up be offensive? So the most crude example, there was this brand, this fashion label many years ago, offended the Christian community because they sent models down the runway with upside down crucifixes. Oh, wow. And so that's an example of similarity. If you look at it at first glance, you're like, oh, that's a cross. That's a crucifix. And then to make it so dissimilar where you're taking something and you're not making it in the way that it's supposed to stay upright, turning it upside down signals, oh, that's disrespectful. Or taking an object that is supposed to be a certain color or a certain style, and then you're like, I'm going to change up the color. That could totally change the context in an inappropriate or misappropriate way that could offend a bunch of people. So I like to rely on the 3 S's there. And from a human perspective, I feel like we should always leave room for nuance. I know some people don't always want to give that much yardage to someone, but I say this because several years ago I gave a talk and I was talking about cultural appropriation, and a white woman came up at the end of the stage and talked to me, and she really enjoyed my talk. And she was just so conflicted. She said, my husband is Indian. My children are biracial. His family tells me to wear their cultural clothing. So what am I supposed to do? If they're cool with it and they consider me family and they want me to wear it, as soon as I walk down the street wearing it, people start attacking me because we make these snap judgments. You don't even know. Maybe that person's married to someone in that community and has children. We just make such snap judgments when we see people on the street and have no idea about the context. We don't even bother to ask why they're wearing something or what it meant to them. Maybe it's a relative or a loved one or partner who's deceased and they're wearing it in memory of them. You just don't know. It's really become such an unraveled discourse, like just such a tight conversation that has divided people. And, I don't want to excuse inappropriate misappropriation where it's disrespectful or someone knows the privilege that they have racially or ethnically, and they're wearing something just because they can, not caring about the sacredness of the item. I don't want to excuse that, but I also just want to know if we can leave some room for asking questions, starting a conversation. Hey, where did you get that? Or why I noticed you're wearing this hairstyle. You never know where the conversation could go.
Thank you so much for that warm response. We just got 3 more questions, 2 related to fashion and 1 fun question, and then we're going to get on out of here. Since we're talking about social justice issues, Kimberly, why is fast fashion a social justice issue Black folks should care about?
Yes. So in terms of fast fashion, whenever I enter these conversations, I have to pause for a moment and acknowledge my own privilege. I am in this fashion studies community, involved in the sustainability community. Some people would argue people in these spaces, you're wagging your finger at people saying, that's bad for the environment, or you should wear this. Meanwhile, there's people who just like, look, I make $1,000 a month. I'm sorry, I'm going to wear fast fashion because I need something to look my best for this job interview. Like, I understand that there's people harmed in the process of making these clothes, but what am I supposed to do? So I think there's been this very kind of gentrified sustainability community, especially in fashion, where it's predominantly white people, many of them having privilege on various levels, who are having nuanced conversations about what we should be wearing and buying. And do you know what that's doing to the environment? It's not fully recognizing not just racialized people, but people who are both racialized and classed at a disadvantage, where they just literally can't afford to wear sustainable wool. That's, this $200 sweater made from this this whole organic outfit. So we have to consider that from a class perspective or race and class perspective. We have to think about what do we do and not just put it on the shoulders of the consumer. Policy. Corporations know that they are working with famous fashion brands, know that they are working with this kind of third party or middleman company in a certain country. And they fully know that this manufacturer that they have kind of outsourced their clothing to is just doing unconscionable business practices, but got to make that money, right? So they're doing that. And we need to hold them accountable. Let the buck land in their lap. They got to figure out what is a more ethical way to make clothing and then bring it back to us to buy. This should not be laying on the shoulders of consumers. Now, consumers should educate themselves and make the best decisions possible. You want to know that there's not children making your clothing, prisoners making your clothing, someone working pregnant for 18 hours on end to make your shirt. Of course we want that, but I think this lands in policy. I've got colleagues doing the hard work, the very unsexy work of constantly going out and working towards passing bills in hopes that they can turn into laws that will hold the industry accountable for all of this. I need people to stop laying it at the feet of consumers, and it's time to hold these corporations and politicians accountable to make ethical clothing for us and as affordable as possible. But also in this very gentrified sustainability space, I've got plenty of Black colleagues who are not getting the recognition they deserve. Technically, the environmental justice movement has been arguably created by Black people, especially in North Carolina. The environmental justice movement cropped up in various places, but people really doing the work and creating these movements that we benefit from, doing all the hard work and protesting. A lot of it's come from Black people in North Carolina who did it by necessity, where there was toxic dumping happening. And so they were doing that, but we don't talk about that. Instead, it's just, I get tired of always seeing it as this just kind of hippie-ish, just like white people have just created environmentalism for us, when it's really, when we talk about sustainability, Black and brown people have been doing this. We've been reusing things, rewearing things, mending things. I mean, it all kind of circles back toward the beginning of our conversation with enslavement. Black people were mending clothes and putting things together by necessity, quilting, reusing bags, doing all that stuff. We've been doing this, but then it gets this new label. It gets repackaged and remarketed to us as a privileged lifestyle. And all these products that are supposed to be sustainable and organic, we've been doing that. We just weren't putting this whole sustainable with a capital S label on it or organic label on it. So end rant, but we've been doing this.
Yes, indeed. Thinking right now about how fashion reflects certain trends in the current political, social landscape. I'm curious, what do you see when you look at the current landscape of fashion? What gives you hope What do you feel needs to change? And what insights do you see from today's current fashion trends?
Fashion trends today. Who do I like now? Who's shaping things?
I like who's shaping things. Yeah.
Who's shaping? I actually have a few names. I like cultural, someone I want to shout out who's been around for well over a decade. Telfar Clemens. Everyone sees the Telfar bags, but I want to bring him up again because I'm just so happy to hear that now he's come up. I mean, this is a long time coming from him. He's been doing this since the early 2000s. You want to talk about a comeback kid creating the It bag, but now he just opened a flagship store in New York. And so that is huge. Some people think, oh, wow, a store, but that takes money in this economy. I mean, that is such a feat. That is amazing. I mean, there's so many Black designers right now who still do not have a store. So the fact that he's opening a flagship store, I want to give a shout out to him. Also, La Roche, style architect, not technically a designer, but, just someone who just really has a grasp and appreciation of fashion history and who just really, has just changed the game when it comes to styling. Anyone who follows his Instagram account, he's not just teaching you fashion history. He's showing what it looks like on a body. Like this is like, especially his long running partnership with Zendaya of just putting her in the 1990s Mugler, ripping through all the closets of fashion history and showing how you can bring it into the present. So it's just truly magical watching that. Another shout out is Rachel Scott, a Jamaican American, just won the CFDA American Women's Wear Design Award, which Black people just don't normally get. So just to recently get that is huge. Her label, which is being sold at all the major stores, Bergdorf's. It's major to mention her name because we don't have a whole lot of Black women who have broken through. Even in Europe, they're still struggling with their Black women designers being able to just get out. It's just so male dominated, especially when it comes to roles like creative director. Rachel Scott is the one to watch. I'd love to see what this award, she was already doing pretty well, but now CFDA award just kind of bust open doors. It creates this whole new credibility to what she's doing. Other designers, I think, also like a Tremaine Emery of Denim Tears. So it's just he's so passionate, thoughtful, intellectual, and cultural. Really, it's a brand with heart that's really doing the work of tying really you and I's whole conversation together.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me see if I can just sneak this in real quick. I got to ask you, when he collabed with Arthur Jaffa on a Supreme t-shirt idea where he put the infamous photograph of the whipped slaves on the front of the shirt and then had the brand changed to a supremacy. The way he plays with certain histories, explicitly like the enslaved history of Black folks in this country, and integrates that into fashion, I do find it a little bit peculiar. I appreciate his passion, but any quick thoughts on that?
I appreciate what he's doing now with Denim Tears. The problem with that is when you're a designer and you're starting to play in those spaces and you're speaking to these broader audiences, even like a Virgil Abloh, the late Virgil Abloh, at that level where you've got this broad audience, there's so much context that gets lost. I find designs like that concerning because he's an intelligent man. He knew at some level what he was doing, but it's just I discourage designs that are just so sacred and painful for us. When you start moving into those larger spaces with larger audiences of people that are not in our community who are kind of ambivalent about these sorts of things, they're not going to respect it and take it in the same way. They're just going to buy it and start wearing it. And we're talking about whipped Black bodies. So that was beyond a misstep for sure. I think he learned his lesson with that. He ended up really having a bad experience and realizing I'm surrounded by racists, and then I'm out of here. It's I think we're learning that. I think 2025 is going to be really interesting because now in this new political climate we're in, you also have a lot of collective exhaustion across the Black community of people you know what, I just want to care for me and mine. I just want to care for my community. It's going to be fascinating to see where that goes in the fashion sense. I'm hoping it leads to designers, stylists, people starting to band together, if they haven't already, stop thinking, I'm going to stop trying to be in this magazine, trying to get a job at this brand or this label that doesn't care about us anyway. I'm hoping it turns into something like Denim Tears with Tremaine Emery, where you just build your own shop, do your own thing. Telfar, he knows exactly who he is, who his community is, and it's doing great. He is not trying to, LVMH could just hire me to be one of their designers. No. We need more Telfars. We need more of that. Just build for your own. I think it's time to stop trying to be accepted where we never were accepted or respected. And so I'm just excited, hopefully, I'm optimistic of where this new political climate will take us with Black fashion and see creative talent banding together.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Last question, because we're putting together a joint playlist for Black liberation. We're asking all of our guests one question. What's one song that has to be on your soundtrack for the revolution?
I have Georgia. So I love Georgia Ann Muldrow. And the song is Mr. President, which I've always loved. It's from well over a decade ago. But I feel like now I would bring it back into the playlist because over a decade later, it works all over again. It's still fresh. So I would say Georgia Ann Muldrow, Mr. President.
That was the amazing and fashion-forward scholar, historian, and fashion guru, Kimberly Jenkins. You can learn more about her work at the Fashion and Race database at fashionandrace.org. And remember, from Negro claws to Nehru collars, there's nothing we can't achieve when we take care of each other and our communities. What do y'all think? Let us know in the comments at Push Black's Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube pages. Find us and tag us at We Are Push Black. And if you found this conversation valuable, please don't forget to share this episode on your social media. Until next week, y'all, be free. You're living in history. Black History Year is a production of Push Black, the nation's largest nonprofit Black media company. Our team includes Brooke Brown, Amber Davis, Mina Davis, Kevin McFall, Gabby Roberts, and Leslie Taylor Grover. Producing the show, we have Cydney Smith and Len Webb, who also edits the show. Black History Year's executive producers are Lilly Workneh and Julian Walker. And I'm your host, Darren Wallace.